My voice is not normal. To list all my impediments, I have a lisp, a stutter, a flat affect, abnormal prosody, and a tendency to mumble. I cannot pronounce certain sounds properly. I went to speech therapy as a child, but I never learned to say SH and TH sounds correctly. I have trouble raising the volume of my voice. When speaking in a car with the radio on, or in a restaurant with loud music, I more often than not have trouble being understood. This is not recent, but a fact of life for me. Throughout my life, my voice has been something I've had to think about, and in multiple instances, I've stopped myself from saying something purely out of the fear that my voice will not be understood by other people. Yet, the analysis of the physical voice is not something that gets a lot of attention, even in disability studies, let alone video essays on YouTube. The world of speech impediments, lisps, and different voices has been a topic left alone. It is time that we enter that world and to seriously engage with a voice that is abnormal. With that said, I want this video to be a much needed exploration. In thinking about my own voice and the ways in which it has impacted my own identity, I have found that expectations surrounding the voice has been used against a multitude of communities, with disabled, queer, and poor voices experiencing an alienation if they stray from what their voice is expected to be. Simply, if someone doesn't speak correctly, violence is imposed upon the voice that betrays expectations and challenges notions of what a voice should sound like. The voice is central to how we are recognized by others. To speak abnormally is to disrupt rigid notions of selfhood and to confront the boundaries of identity as we understand it today. There is no such thing as speaking like a neurotypical or an autistic, deaf or hearing, man or woman. There is only the voice of power that binds our ideological restraints with every word we speak. In laying out the ways in which the voice produces hierarchy, we can begin with the French Marxist Louis Althusser. In Althusser's essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Althusser coins the popular theory of ideology and interpolation. To summarize it quickly, ideology is the collection of ideas that produce a given society to act in certain ways. Ideology is a voice that tells us that we must do something, that we must go to school, must work, must form a family, and must operate under capitalism. Ideology is also material, being produced by the state, their institutions, and their corresponding class politics. This ideology is cemented through the performance of everyday rituals, where the lessons of work or of the school produce the knowledge that we abide by. This can be seen through the rules of classroom etiquette in the US. Students must raise their hand and wait until they are recognized by the teacher to speak, prescribing a hierarchy onto the teacher-student relationship. You very rarely work with the teacher in school, but rather work for the teacher. This ritual in the classroom is performed to prepare the students for their future relationship of being a worker for a boss. It leads students to internalize an ideology of obedient production and efficiency. How does this ideology function? For Althusser, it functions through the act of hailing. Take this scenario as an example. You are walking down the street, and a policeman suddenly yells from behind, "Hey, you." Typically, a person will turn around to face the policeman, and this recognition of the yelling cop is exactly how ideology functions. You understand yourself in relation to the cop, recognize the cop as an authority that you must respect, and thus submit to the cop's demands by stopping and turning to face him. This is not the only example. The ways in which you recognize any given individual is the result of the ways in which ideology imposes itself upon a person. It is true that we act around people differently depending on who they are. We talk to a person in a t-shirt differently than we do to a man in a suit. Same thing with how we speak to our teachers or bosses, or a number of different identity structures that we experience every day. This is a result of ideology, our society's way of imposing ideas upon us, enforce the ways in which we experience other people, and creates a difference in how we talk to a person in a suit versus a person in a t-shirt, even though the only difference between the two are their clothes. In reading Althusser's theory of ideology and interpolation, what sticks out to me is the fact that this act of hailing occurs through the voice. It is not the act of saying the cop, but rather the act of hearing the cop yell that introduces a person to ideology. What this does is produce a voice of power. Through the various ideologies imposed upon a person, the voice takes on a symbolic value. Through the accent, the voice is infused with ideologies of class, depending on whether an individual has a southern accent or a posh British accent. It is infused with ideologies of homophobia, with the essentialist notion of there being a gay lisp, or ways of speaking that predict a person's sexuality. And as mentioned before, ableism is also infused into the recognition of the disabled voice, with an autistic individual's flat affect being linked to the prejudicial notion that autistic people lack empathy. All of this is located in the voice. The way we speak is not something to be ignored, but rather something to be brought up as a reproduction of power and ideology. The yell of the policeman does not stutter, but is imbued with the vocal symbolism of capitalist power. This can be highlighted by paying attention to the fact that Althusser genders the policeman. While it's a minor note, it is necessary for Althusser to make the person who yells a man. The masculine gendering of the cop imbues the yell with an ideology of patriarchy, as the recognition of the cop as an authority is contingent on the recognition of a dominant, patriarchal masculinity. In the same way that a policeman's voice does not stutter, it also is not female. The disruption of the dominant voice, whether that be the able-bodied or masculine voice, breaks up the entire act of hailing. The voice of the cop must also be the voice of power. Otherwise, recognition of the cop as an authority breaks down entirely. Yet, this performance of the voice does break down in real life. There are voices that stutter, and voices that betray norms of class, gender, sexuality, and race. What happens when the expectation surrounding the voice is disrupted, and we are forced into recognizing the abnormal voice? A violence ensues, with acts of social alienation and sometimes physical attacks repressing the voice as raised from the normative. The stuttering voice finds itself in speech therapy before long, in an effort to become a voice that conforms to power. Voices that are different are beat down until they are marginalized or become normal. That is the game that power plays. Ask yourself how often you hear a voice that stutters on the TV, and then ask yourself why that is.
Were your classmates ever mean to you in school?
Some laughed and called me names. Far more walked by me like I didn't exist.
Disabled voices are confrontational. They disrupt able-bodied modes of communication. They force you to listen closely and to focus on each syllable. Some voices are raspy, some voices stutter, and some mumble. It requires effort to listen to the disabled voice, whether it be my voice or Peterson's. The ability to process language immediately, or to focus on another task while continuing to listen, is something that able-bodied people take for granted, and the disabled voice blows that expectation out of the water. The disabled voice engages in a different form of communication that makes different demands upon the listener. Because of that tension between disabled voices and able-bodied communication, people with speech disorders oftentimes are alienated during their youth. If they are not physically removed from the classroom in order to visit a speech therapist or to be placed within special education, then they are socially isolated by their able-bodied peers. All too often, people with speech impediments find themselves deprived of social interactions, and this leads to heightened rates of depression and suicidality. When we look past the social experiences of the school, we find a similar alienation in labor. People with communication differences have an unemployment rate of 67.4%. Disabled voices exist as a significant minority in the labor force, with differences in communication leading to a huge disparity in employment. So, just in these two institutions of the school and labor, the two institutions that we occupy from early childhood to old age, we see an exclusion of disabled voices. What this exclusion produces is a violence where only able-bodied voices are able to exist under capitalism, and that a person with differences in communication must rid themselves of their speech impediment in order to participate in social and economic spaces. This is seen in the medicalization of the speech disorder. For speech therapy and its proponents, there is no question of accepting differences in speaking, but rather an immediate mission to cure clients of their speech impediments and to allow disabled voices to speak normally. Yet, this idea of speaking normally is presupposed by the capitalist industry of speech therapy and the marginalization of disabled voices. The person who stutters is only abnormal and in need of a cure because people with speech impediments are excluded from able-bodied capitalism. In other words, it's not that people who stutter can't talk, but rather that able-bodied people refuse to listen. A similar dynamic occurs when neurotypicals hear autistic voices. Autism researchers have observed that autistic individuals often speak with a flat affect, abnormal prosody, and tend to speak in a monotone fashion. These differences in speech connect with the autistic's differences in neurology. Autistic people often experience a breakdown in social communication, and this breakdown is accentuated by differences in speech. Here, we can pay careful attention not only to the matter of being understood easily, but also to the complexities of speech. We oftentimes understand one another through giving certain sounds different tones, with the raised pitch of a voice suggesting a question or perhaps suspicion, and the lowered pitch of a voice implying disappointment or sadness. Language and the exchange of information through words is not just the ability to make certain sounds, but also agreed upon nuances that inform language, such as the tone of an individual's voice. More simply, prosody and inflection are not just ways of speaking, they also convey meaning. When you take this usage of speech to the disabled voice, and specifically autistic ways of speaking, this ability to convey meaning is oftentimes lost. Autistics not only struggle to naturally understand the unwritten social nuances of tone and how to communicate meaning through inflection of the voice, but they're oftentimes just unable to do so because of their flat affect and monotone way of speaking. Autistic speech is a different, yet equally as valid mode of communication, but it is rejected because of the dominance of neurotypical communication. Due to the centering of neurotypical communication, autistics and their different ways of speaking are either excluded, or autistics, such as myself, become the clients of speech therapists in an effort to speak like a neurotypical. Disabled voices that challenge able-bodied modes of communication face a hopeless situation. They either become marginalized, socially isolated, and unemployed due to the exclusion of abnormal voices from capitalism, or they learn to emulate able-bodied ways of speaking through the medical apparatus of speech therapy. Pass as able-bodied or be erased. That is the lesson of our capitalist, able-bodied society.
For something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim.
The violence against different voices is not just limited to disabled people. It expands to all voices that resist ideology and displace power. This then leads us to the LGBTQ+ community and the ways in which homophobia and transphobia utilizes the voice as an object of difference. Here, it becomes obvious that our society has gendered the voice. Our ideology tells us that there's an essentially male voice and an essentially female voice, with the voice being gendered on a flimsy basis. If a voice possesses bass or has a lower pitch, then that voice is gendered as masculine. If a voice is high-pitched or possesses vocal fry, then that voice is gendered as feminine. When laid out in this manner, the entire existence of the gendered voice becomes outright silly. The pitch of someone's voice isn't at all connected to gender identity. Yet, it's undeniable that this connection of the voice to gender is pervasive. It is socially taught that a deeper voice is more masculine, and for this ideology, young boys are unconsciously conditioned to speak with bass. Male voices are not the result of biology, but rather a social aspect where a voice is molded according to social pressures, such as patriarchy and expectations of masculinity. Here, we come to Judith Butler's concept of gender performativity. To summarize quickly, Butler argues that gender is not inherent, but rather that gender is an act that is conditioned to be perceived as reality for the performance of gendered rituals, thus making gender performative. From this concept, we can understand that the voice is also a performance that initiates an individual to a given gender. That expectation surrounding gender molds a voice into either sounding masculine or feminine. A voice is not inherently male or female, but rather performed to fit within prescribed gender norms. Yet, it is true that not everyone's voice is able to neatly fit in this binary of male voices and female voices. What happens if the gendering of the voice doesn't conform to the gender identity of an individual? Bigotry and violence are used in order to place that person within their gendered place. This can be seen in the transphobic attack by Republican politician Jasmina Saavedra, who harassed a trans woman in a bathroom because she had a quote, male voice. For Saavedra, all that is needed for the identification of gender is a voice. Transphobia naturalizes a gender binary for the sound of a voice, while attempting to marginalize all voices that don't conform to a rigid gender identity. Here, gender nonconforming voices must also either pass or be erased, facing the violence of transphobia if they break expectations surrounding gender. This enforcement of the gendered voice is not only limited to incidents of public harassment by transphobic Republicans, it is also produced by everyday practices that marginalizes voices that don't conform to the gender binary. The gendered voice is also enforced through casual remarks such as talk like a man, or the schoolyard bully who makes fun of students with voices that stray from their gender presentation. While these practices are mundane, and perhaps even accepted within our broader culture, they still represent a transphobic policing of gender identity that seeks to keep people within boundaries of what's considered normal. What this all amounts to is a reassertion of power for the usage of the voice as an object of difference, that through attacking voices that are different or voices that challenge pre-existing ideologies, hierarchies are established at the level of language and what a voice is able to sound like. By making sure voices perform rigid gender identities, what these acts of repression effectively create is an understanding of the voice which ultimately reproduces transphobia.
So, there are institutional powers like psychiatric normalization, and there are informal kinds of practices like bullying, which try to keep us in our gendered place. There's a real question for me about how such gender norms get established and policed, and what the best way is to disrupt them and to overcome the police function. It's my view that gender is culturally formed, but it's also a domain of agency or freedom. It's most important to resist the violence that is imposed by ideal gender norms, especially against those who are gender different, who are non-conforming in their gender presentation.
In a 2018 article, writer Julia Pelly reflects on her son's Southern accent and her worries about his twang, writing that, "I don't want outsiders to read his voice as stupid or poor or backwards because of his accent." Just in this small anecdote, we can observe how the voice becomes infused with class ideologies. Certain voices are regarded as poor, with other signifiers of poverty being attached onto the poor voice, such as a lack of education or intelligence, in order to associate the Southern voice with a negative difference. Here, the voice is used as an object that betrays any sort of class disguise. Anybody can wear a suit and tie, but the voice is something physical that can't be easily changed. This is what makes the voice an important symbol of wealth. It makes class physical rather than social, representing economic status through the ways in which a person speaks, rather than through the way a person acts. As such, it embodies class in a way that other symbols of wealth are unable to do. While I don't want to get too literary here, there's no example that better shows this intersection of voice and class than the play Pygmalion. Here's a quick summary of Pygmalion. After exiting church, two upper-class men who are trained in linguistics, named Higgins and Pickering, come across an impoverished girl named Eliza Doolittle. After seeing Eliza, Higgins and Pickering make a bet on whether Eliza can be taught to pass as a duchess in 6 months. From this point on, the two focus on phonetic training, with Eliza dropping her broken English in exchange for a bourgeois, proper way of speaking. 6 months later, Eliza is able to successfully pass as an English duchess. However, Eliza decides to leave Higgins and Pickering while also deciding to marry a middle-class man, ultimately rejecting the morals of the British upper class. In Pygmalion, the voice is upheld as a symbol of class. It is Eliza's broken English and heavy accent that marks her as being poor, and it's also the development of her voice that most enables her to pass as an upper-class lady and achieve social mobility. This is shown in the first act of the play, where Higgins remarks that a woman who utters such depressing and disgusting sounds has no right to be anywhere, no right to live, condemning Eliza to a subhumanity on the basis of her broken English. It is Eliza's voice that marks her as different and draws the contempt of Higgins. Class ideologies are contained inside of the voice, ultimately making the ways we speak a location of class warfare. Poor voices are banished to the steel cage of poverty, while rich voices are given jobs and wealth on the basis of their ability to speak properly. While Pygmalion was written within a different context than today, the points made by the play have not changed. Even today, you see a pressure to speak in certain ways, and these pressures often reproduce divisions of class. If you can't speak in a way that businesses want you to, then you are cut off from high-paying jobs and upward mobility within your career. It was mentioned earlier that speech impediments and communication disorders are correlated with large disparities in income and employment rates, leading to the exclusion of disabled voices from able-bodied capitalism. These same disparities connect to other voices that also challenge ideology. In this area, Professor Jeffrey Groger finds that racially distinctive speech patterns earn lower wages on average, connecting the white supremacist roots of American capitalism to the usage of the voice as an object of difference. Returning back to the article by Pelley, Groger also finds that white Southern workers also experience disparities in wages, confirming Pelley's suspicion that businesses will discriminate against her son due to the presence of a heavy Southern accent. The fact that differences in accent, dialect, and speaking patterns are associated with disparities in wages unveils the intersection between class and speech. The voice informs and confirms divisions of class, reducing upward mobility by making sure that individuals who grew up and learned language within their community's linguistic traditions remain within oppressive structures of class warfare. As George Bernard Shaw writes in the preface to Pygmalion, it is impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman hate or despise him. The added difference in the US is that it's difficult for an American to speak without revealing their own class identity, their own radical difference. All of these attitudes surrounding the voice construct an ideology. Voices that are socially constructed to be normal are censored and placed within positions of power, while abnormal voices are marginalized. This is an old-fashioned hierarchy, and one that is built upon the logic of capitalism. The voice is normalized in order to uphold not only profit, but the status quo of the economic system, with disability, class, and gender discrimination being important conflicts that enables capitalism to function. Because of this, individuals who have voices of difference are motivated to fix their voice. When the difference between a stutter and an able-bodied voice is being able to put food on the table or being unemployed, you're damn sure that people are going to work really hard to talk without any noticeable speech impediments. This is the conflict that speech therapy builds itself upon. While there are certainly valid reasons to go see a speech therapist, a lot of speech therapy centers on correcting abnormal voices. The goal, both of speech therapy and capitalism as a broader system, is to eliminate abnormal voices, either through a process of correction or by marginalizing individuals who are unable to be corrected by our system of medical and social apparatuses. In saying this, we can analyze the politics of the voice. The politics of the voice today is rather simple. The voice is used as an object of difference that excludes certain individuals while including others based on how their voice sounds. This holds a political value, as the voices that are excluded tend to belong to communities that our political system systematically disenfranchise. As said before, those in power utilize the voice as an object to divide and conquer. However, politics is not just a story of the powerful and the oppressed. There are individuals who escape this narrative of marginalization while also holding on to their voice. Here, the defiant usage of an abnormal voice, despite the violence waged upon it, emerges as a radical refusal. By continuing to use a stutter or not giving a shit about a flat affect, you are effectively not playing a game prescribed by capitalism and its social structures. We can think of this as a Bartleby lesson. Sometimes, just the act of saying no or refusing to live your life by the rules of power is itself an incredibly radical act. However, on the political left, this discourse on the voice is left completely untouched, despite its apparent usage of capitalist ideology and hierarchy. While I will restrain myself from launching it into a full-blown rant, it's apparent to me that the left doesn't pay too much attention to the ways in which ideology manifests itself within physical practices. However, the voice of difference is a location of resistance to capitalist ideology by making the listener converse in different ways. We can think of this through black dialects or black accents. The way we speak is not just how we exchange information, but also the story of where we come from and how we got here. The voice contains our characters and our histories, whether that be through an Igbo accent or the tone we give to certain words. The violence against these voices represents an attempted erasure of those stories, and it's important to highlight the stories our voices tell, regardless of what the system has to say. Here, talking with our abnormal voices is both a radical refusal and an anarchic gesture. It is an act that displaces power and challenges the normalization of the voice that surrounds us. I started the video with this, so I suppose I'll end it with a final reflection on my voice. I don't know if I'll ever get to a place where I stop disliking my voice. I get tired of repeating it myself, and I have a feeling that my ability to properly communicate will be something that job interviewers pick up on. The tendency to mumble and to slur words is not fun for me, and even in presenting abnormal voices as a radical refusal, I don't want to lie. This shit fucking sucks. I've been through speech therapy to the point I was taken out of class every day for half an hour. Let me repeat that to make it extra clear. I was removed from my education just to fix my voice. I can show you all the IAP documents as proof. Yet, my voice persists, with my slurring, flat affect, and abnormal prosody, and I have a feeling none of that is going away anytime soon. I don't want to give in to self-pity too much, but I'll say this. I think my voice is something that's hurt the quality of my videos. I'm not easily understood. I think there's probably a bunch of content creators out there who are amazing, yet get passed over because they speak differently or have a speech impediment. It's just something that's bound to happen in our world, and especially on an audio-visual platform like YouTube. Even in the video essay sphere, this shit is supposed to be fun, not hard work, and listening to a voice that communicates differently can oftentimes be difficult. However, I refuse to abandon what makes my voice unique. Even with everything I've said, I still find myself attached to my voice. I don't give a shit about my voice being torture to listen to, or having to repeat myself, or whatever frustration that my speech produces for other people. My voice is one of the things that I can say is undeniably mine, containing my character and story just in the way I speak. I'm not giving up that shit. I shouldn't have to give it up, regardless of the system that I run up against. I'll continue to speak my abnormal voice defiantly, and for whatever my opinion's worth, I think you should too.